A giant of Texas and national politics was Lyndon B. Johnson. After working as a teacher and congressional aide, he won a special election to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1937, where he quickly emerged as an energetic New Deal Democrat and a skilled advocate for rural electrification and military preparedness. In 1948, Johnson narrowly won a hotly contested race for the U.S. Senate, a victory that launched him into national prominence. Once in the Senate, he rose with unprecedented speed, becoming Senate Majority Whip in 1951, Minority Leader in 1953, and ultimately Senate Majority Leader in 1955, where his mastery of negotiation and coalition building made him one of the most powerful legislators in the country. Known for his relentless work ethic and the famously persuasive Johnson treatment, he shaped major legislative priorities and forged alliances that strengthened the Democratic Party's congressional leadership. By the time John F. Kennedy selected him as his running mate in 1960, Johnson had spent more than 2 decades in Congress and had established himself as a dominant force in national politics, wielding influence unmatched by any Senate leader of his era. Johnson's addition to the national Democratic ticket unsettled the political landscape in Texas. Conservatives bristled at what they saw as the increasingly liberal direction of the National Party, while liberals remained suspicious of Johnson's long-standing ties to the state's moderate conservative establishment. These tensions were reflected in the 1960 general election, where the Kennedy-Johnson ticket carried Texas over Republicans Richard Nixon and Henry Cabot Lodge by a razor-thin margin of roughly 26,000 votes. Johnson had to resign his Senate seat in order to become vice president. Thus, in 1961, there would be a special election to replace him. Voters would support Republican John Tower, becoming the first Republican U.S. Senator of Texas since Reconstruction. As of 2025, Republicans have retained control of that seat. As Republicans were gaining in confidence, the Texas Democratic Party was splintering between the more moderate Johnson and liberal Yarborough. In 1962, the Johnson ally John B. Connally defeated Yarborough and the incumbent, Price Daniel, who was seeking his 4th term. Although Connally would win the general, the Republican nominee, Jack Cox, received 46% of the vote, a sign that the Republicans were becoming more competitive. Republicans had many reasons to be hopeful in the coming 1964 election and that it would translate to victory in the presidential election. However, on November 22, 1963, President Kennedy would be assassinated and Governor Connally seriously wounded in Dallas. Kennedy's death elevated Johnson to the presidency, and thus the leadership of the Democratic Party. Connally would assume greater command of the state party as well. Kennedy's assassination, the remaining state of national mourning, and Johnson's portrayal of his Republican challenger Senator Barry Goldwater as essentially unhinged meant electoral disaster for the Republicans. Johnson easily carried not just Texas, but go on to win one of the biggest electoral landslides of the 20th century. The state races down the ticket also did not fare well. Yarborough easily defended his seat against his challenger, George H.W. Bush, and Connally was able to secure both renomination and re-election. Bruce Alger, the lone Texas Republican in the U.S. Congress, lost his re-election bid. Although Governor Connally was a protege of President Johnson, he strategically distanced himself from Johnson's Great Society initiatives and focused his attention on economic growth, better colleges and universities, and greater out-of-state investment. Despite his successes, liberals criticized his emphasis on the Texas economy rather than the needs of the poor and minorities. They would reject many of his proposed reforms through the legislature, such as increasing gubernatorial terms to 4 years and having annual legislative sessions. When he left the governorship in 1969, he remained popular amongst Texans. After leaving office, President Richard Nixon appointed Connally as his Secretary of the Treasury. In addition, he chaired the Democrats for Nixon campaign and announced he switched to being a Republican in 1973. He would get involved in the primary race between Gerald Ford and Ronald Reagan in 1976, ultimately supporting Ford for the Republican nomination. In 1979, he briefly sought the Republican nomination for president, but he dropped out after the South Carolina primary and endorsed Reagan. In turn, Reagan attempted to appoint him Secretary of Energy, but he refused. Texas Republicans did not fare as well as they had hoped in the election of 1968. In 1966, John Tower was able to win re-election to his Senate seat, and 3 more Republicans represented Texas in the House of Representatives, one of which was George H.W. Bush. Vice President Hubert Humphrey, the Democratic nominee, carried Texas. Despite enthusiasm over Nixon's victory, Texas Republicans gained less ground than they had hoped. They had made gains in the state legislature, but they were moderate at best.